Sarah stayed at the railing for another few minutes, alone with the machine she had spent 7 years building, listening to the low hum of the capacitors charging in the desert morning air. She thought about her father, who had taught her that every machine was a conversation between human beings and the laws of physics. A question asked in metal and electricity, waiting for the universe to answer. She thought about what question Atlas I was asking. She thought she knew. The question was, how far can we reach? General Thomas Brooks was 58 years old, barrel-chested, silver-haired, and possessed of a voice that sounded like gravel being poured down a metal pipe. He had served in 3 wars on 2 continents and had spent the last decade of his career arguing in closed Senate sessions that America needed to think differently about the future of warfare, not just on Earth but beyond it. He had been laughed at in those sessions. Politely, professionally, but laughed at nonetheless. He was not laughing now. He stood at the head of the control room, a vast, climate-controlled space full of screens and terminals and the very best engineers and scientists his country had been able to find, and watched the countdown clock on the main display tick toward 0. Beside him stood Colonel Lisa Reyes, his second-in-command, sharp, quiet, brilliant in the way that people who never needed to raise their voices were brilliant. She was watching the power readings with an expression that General Brooks had learned, over years of working together, meant she was concerned but not alarmed. "Talk to me, Lisa," he said quietly. "Capacitor banks are at 98%, she said. "We'll be at full charge in 63 minutes. The thermal management system is running about 2 degrees warmer than projected, but well within tolerance." She paused. "It's going to work, Tom?" "I know it's going to work." "Then why do you look like a man waiting for a root canal?" "Because when it works," he said, "everything changes." Lisa looked at him. "That was the point." "I know." He clasped his hands behind his back and stared at the main screen. "I just want to be sure we're ready for what comes after the point." What came after the point was a question that nobody in the room, not Sarah Vance, not Marcus Webb, not General Brooks, not the 12 senators who had quietly authorized the project's funding, not the President of the United States who was watching via secure feed from Washington, could fully answer. They had plans, projections, strategic assessments running to thousands of pages. They had thought about what Atlas I meant for national defense, for international relations, for the balance of global military power. They had not thought, because they could not have known to think, about what it meant for anything beyond the Earth. Up in orbit, in a monitoring vessel running silent with all active sensors masked to avoid detection, Creelan Sauce stared at her screens and felt something she had not felt in 62 standard cycles of monitoring this small, violent, strangely compelling planet. She felt afraid. Not of the weapon itself. The weapon was primitive by galactic standards. Electromagnetic acceleration of a physical projectile was a technology that most civilizations figured out within a century or 2 of their industrial period, and the continuance had long since moved past physical projectiles to energy-based and quantum disruption systems that made railguns look like children throwing rocks. What frightened Creelan was something else. What frightened her was the power. She pulled the numbers up again and checked them a 4th time, because she still didn't quite believe them. The energy levels this installation was drawing, the raw, staggering quantity of electrical power being channeled into those capacitor banks, was not consistent with what Earth should be able to generate. According to the Continuance's development models, Earth was a Type 0.73 civilization on the Kardashev scale. A civilization at that level should be able to generate perhaps 1/3 of the energy that Atlas I was currently consuming. But they were doing it anyway. Somehow, impossibly, these creatures on their dirt planet had figured out how to squeeze more power out of their primitive energy infrastructure than any development model said they should be capable of. They had looked at the limits of what their technology could do and then, apparently, simply decided to ignore those limits. Creelan had been monitoring civilizations for her entire career. She knew how development was supposed to work. She knew the curves, the models, the trajectories. Every species followed them, more or less. There were variations. Some civilizations developed faster in certain areas, slower in others, but the curves always held in the end. Earth was not following the curve. Earth had never followed the curve. That, Creelan realized, was what made them different. Not their biology. Not their culture. Not their endless, exhausting wars with each other. It was this: when humans encountered a limit, their first instinct was not to accept it. Their first instinct was to find out if the limit was actually real. She opened a communication channel to the Continuance Bureau of Developing Worlds. "This is Ambassador Sauce, filing an urgent supplementary report on Earth, Class 7 Developing World, Galactic Registry Number." "Ambassador." The voice of the duty clerk at the bureau was professionally bored. "Is this another standard monitoring update?" No, Creelan said. This is a priority 2 alert. Pause. In the background she could hear the clerk sit up straighter. Priority 2 alerts were rare. They meant something genuinely unexpected was happening. Go ahead, Ambassador. The humans, Creelan said carefully, are doing something I have never seen a Class 7 civilization do before. What are they doing? Creelan looked at her screens. At the power readings. At the long dark shape of Atlas, one stretched across the desert. At the countdown timer she had isolated from their communications. 51 minutes and counting. They are building a railgun, she said. Another pause. Longer this time. Ambassador, railgun technology is standard for Class 7 to Class 8 transition period. That's not unusual. The power levels are unusual, Creelan said. The scale is unusual. The speed of development is unusual. She pulled up her historical data and began transmitting it alongside her report. I have been monitoring this species for 62 cycles. In that time, they have advanced from pre-industrial technology to this. That is not a natural development curve. That is, she searched for the right word. That is something else. The clerk was quiet for a long moment. I'll flag your report for senior review, Ambassador, he said finally. Flag it for Arbiter Council review, Creelan said. Not senior. Arbiter. The clerk's professionalism slipped just slightly. Ambassador, Arbiter Council review is reserved for situations that don't fit the standard models, Creelan said. Yes, I know. She looked at the countdown timer. 49 minutes. Please file my report as I've requested. She closed the channel and turned back to her screens. 49 minutes. She had a feeling the galaxy was about to learn something new about humanity. She had a feeling it was not going to be comfortable. The control room was absolutely silent at T-10 seconds. Not the forced silence of people trying to be professional. The real silence. The kind that settles over a room when every person in it has stopped breathing at exactly the same moment because what is about to happen is too large for breath. Sarah stood at her station, both hands flat on the console in front of her, watching the numbers count down on the main screen. Her cold coffee sat forgotten at her elbow. Marcus was 3 stations to her left, headset on, eyes fixed on the power readings. General Brooks stood at the back of the room with his arms crossed and his face absolutely still. Colonel Reyes had her hand over her mouth. 10. The capacitor banks, 12 of them each the size of a warehouse, were fully charged. The energy stored in them was equivalent to the output of a mid-sized power plant over 6 hours, compressed and ready, waiting for the microsecond that the firing sequence would release it all at once. 9. The projectile, a tungsten rod, precisely machined, 30 centimeters long, 8 centimeters in diameter, weighing exactly 14 kilograms, sat at the base of the 2-kilometer barrel in its launch cradle. It had no explosive payload. It needed none. At the velocities Atlas I was designed to achieve, a tungsten rod hitting a target had the kinetic energy of a small artillery shell. At longer ranges, with atmosphere factored out, the numbers became genuinely frightening. The targeting array was locked on a section of dry lakebed 40 kilometers down the range, an impact zone that had been prepared with sensor grids to measure the strike, surrounded by cameras, microphones, seismic monitors, and every other instrument the team had thought to bring. 7. Sarah thought about her father again. Thought about him teaching her to ride a bike in their driveway in Columbus, her screaming that she was going to fall, him running alongside her with his hand on the seat, and then the moment when she realized, mid-pedal, that he had let go 3 seconds ago and she was doing it herself. 6. She thought about what it felt like to do something yourself for the first time. 5. All systems nominal, Marcus said, and his voice was steady and calm, and Sarah loved him a little bit for that. 4. General Brooks uncrossed his arms. 3. Colonel Reyes lowered her hand from her mouth. 2. Sarah closed her eyes. 1. Fire. The sound was not what she expected. She had expected a boom. An enormous, ear-splitting, chest-compressing boom that would rattle the windows and shake the floor and announce to the world in no uncertain terms that something extraordinary had just happened. What she got instead was something far stranger. There was a sound, yes, but it wasn't quite a boom. It was more like a crack. A single, impossibly sharp crack, like the largest lightning bolt in history striking at point-blank range. It lasted less than 1/10 of a second. And then it was gone, replaced by a sound that was almost musical. A deep, resonant hum that rolled outward from the barrel in a wave that Sarah felt in her teeth and her chest and the spaces between her ribs. The floor shook. Not violently, just enough to feel it through the soles of her feet. And then the screens exploded with data. Projectile away. Marcus's voice, still calm, still steady. Velocity at exit. Mach 28.7. Slightly below target but within tolerance. Barrel integrity nominal, no thermal breach. Power draw confirmed, capacitors discharged in 1.4 seconds. All 12 banks. Where's the projectile? General Brooks cut across the room. Tracking, said Lieutenant Jamie Torres, the targeting specialist, fingers flying over her keyboard. Trajectory is nominal. Range estimate to impact. A pause. 11 seconds. 11 seconds. The room held its breath again. On the big screen, the feed from the impact zone cameras showed the dry lakebed baking in the morning sun, flat, empty, utterly still. The camera feeds were 60 frames per second. Even so, nobody expected to see the projectile coming. What they saw, at second 9, was a column of displaced air, a shock wave visible as a ripple in the heat shimmer over the desert, racing ahead of the tungsten rod at the speed of sound. What they saw at second 11 was a moment so fast that the cameras only caught it as a white blur. What they saw at second 11.003 was the impact. The tungsten rod hit the dry lakebed at approximately Mach 26. It had bled some velocity through atmospheric drag, which was expected, and the result was not an explosion in the conventional sense. It was something more visceral. The rod didn't explode. It arrived. It arrived with such staggering violence that the lakebed around the impact point simply ceased to exist for a radius of 12 meters, vaporized and ejected outward in a ring of superheated dust and rock that rose into the desert sky like the finger of some ancient god pointing upward. The shockwave hit the nearest sensor array 3 seconds later and knocked 3 of the cameras offline. The seismic monitors registered the impact at 2.1 on the Richter scale. 4 full seconds after the impact, the control room was completely silent. Then Marcus Webb said in a voice that was still somehow perfectly calm, "Direct hit. Impact point within 6 meters of target center. Terminal velocity approximately Mach 26.1. Kinetic energy transfer estimated at," he stopped. Checked his numbers. "Dr. Vance, I'm reading terminal kinetic energy of approximately 214 megajoules." Sarah opened her eyes. 214 megajoules, she repeated. "Yes, ma'am." She thought about that number for a moment. A standard 155 mm artillery shell, the kind that armies had been using for a century, delivered roughly 10 to 15 megajoules of energy. Atlas, one had just delivered 20 times that with a projectile that had no explosive payload, that could be recharged and fired again, that had no propellant to run out, that was, once the infrastructure was built, essentially unlimited. She picked up her cold coffee. Took a sip. Put it back down. "Run diagnostics on the barrel," she said. "Full thermal scan. I want barrel integrity numbers in 20 minutes. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus said. General Brooks walked across the room to stand beside her. He didn't say anything. He just looked at the impact camera feeds, at the rising pillar of dust and the scarred lakebed and the 12-meter crater that hadn't been there 9 seconds ago. After a long moment, he said, "How long to reload?" 4 minutes for capacitor recharge, Sarah said. 30 seconds for projectile loading. We can fire again in 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Rate of fire? Theoretically, 12 to 15 rounds per hour at sustained rate. With a prepared magazine and dedicated loading crew, possibly faster. She paused. "Of course, we need to assess barrel wear before." "Dr. Vance." General Brooks's voice was quiet. The gravel in it had softened into something else. Something she hadn't heard from him before. "You've done something remarkable here." Sarah looked at the impact feeds again. At the crater. At the dust still hanging in the desert air. "We've done something," she said. "I'm not sure yet what it means." It meant more than either of them knew. Up in orbit, Creelan Sauce had watched the entire firing sequence through her sensor arrays, and she was now doing something she had not done in 40 years of diplomatic service. She was panicking. Not outwardly. Outwardly she was perfectly composed, still, precise, professional. But inside, in the carefully ordered Vitheriai emotional architecture that governed her inner life, something had cracked. She had seen the power draw. She had seen the projectile exit velocity. She had tracked the rod through its ballistic arc, brief, brutal, impossibly fast, and she had watched the impact and she had run the numbers, and the numbers had made her sit very still for a very long time. Roll was watching her. "Ambassador? I need you to do something," Creelan said. "Of course. Pull up the Continuance Tactical Database. Specifically, the section on kinetic impact weaponry." Roll complied. The database was comprehensive, 47 species worth of weapons development history, catalogued over thousands of years. He scanned through it, pulling the relevant sections. What am I looking for? The Earth weapon, Krillin said, just delivered a terminal kinetic energy impact of approximately 214 of their megajoules. I want to know how that compares to the first-generation kinetic weapons developed by other continuance member species. Roll worked for a few minutes in silence. Then he looked up. His expression, usually cheerful, usually relaxed, was carefully neutral in the way Vitherii went carefully neutral when they were trying not to show distress. It's more powerful, he said. By how much? The median first-generation kinetic weapon among current continuance species delivered approximately 40 to 80 of their equivalent megajoules at terminal impact. He paused. Earth's first-generation weapon delivered 214. 2 to 5 times more powerful, Krillin said. Yes. And the velocity? Roll checked. The median exit velocity for first-generation kinetic weapons was equivalent to approximately Mach 12 to 18. Earth achieved Mach 28.7 at exit. Nearly twice the velocity of the galactic median. Yes. Krillin stared at her screens. At the dust still rising from the desert below. At the crater, so small from orbit, so utterly devastating up close. Roll, she said. In your assessment, and I want your honest assessment, not your diplomatic assessment, where does this place humanity in terms of weapons development relative to the galactic community? Roll was quiet for a moment. Long enough that Krillin turned to look at him. If I'm being honest, Roll said, this weapon as it stands today, could threaten every vessel in our monitoring fleet. It could reach low orbit from the surface. At the velocities achieved, our standard hull materials would not stop it. He paused again. And Ambassador, this is their first one. First prototype. First test. If they continue on this development curve. They always continue, Krillin said. Yes, Roll said. They always do. Krillin turned back to her screens. She thought about the report she needed to file. She thought about the words she would need to use. She thought about the 47 member species of the galactic continuance, many of whom had been comfortable in their technological superiority for so long that the concept of a younger species catching up, or surpassing them, was essentially unthinkable. She thought about how to explain humanity to people who had never taken the time to understand it. She thought about how to explain that the gap between what these creatures should be capable of and what they actually did was not a statistical anomaly, was a pattern. And it had been repeating for 430 years. She opened her communication channel again. This is Ambassador Krillin Sauce, she said. I am filing an emergency Priority 1 report on Earth, Class 7 Developing World. On the other end of the line she heard the duty clerk go very still. Priority 1 reports meant one thing. The established order of the galaxy had just changed. Priority 1 report filed at 1442 standard cycles, the clerk said, his voice tight. Ambassador, please state the nature of the emergency. Krillin took a breath. Humanity, she said, has just demonstrated weapons technology that exceeds the median galactic standard. I am recommending immediate Continuance Council review and requesting urgent consultation with the Arbiter Assembly. She paused. And I am recommending that we update our records for Earth immediately. Update them how, Ambassador? Krillin looked down at the planet below, blue and white and beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Change their classification, she said. They are not a Class 7 developing world anymore. The galactic continuance had 47 member species. Of those 47, the 7 most powerful, in terms of technology, fleet strength, territorial control, and political influence, made up what was informally called the Inner Council. They were the Vitherii, the Dranan, the Sul Collective, the Marith, the Hive of Ton, the Pelori Republic, and the Ancient Ones of Corvin. These 7 species had, between them, shaped the galaxy's political landscape for the past 4,000 years. They were not accustomed to surprises. Krillin's Priority 1 report reached the Inner Council within 6 standard hours of Atlas 1's first firing. By that time she had also transmitted the full sensor data, power readings, projectile tracking, impact analysis, velocity measurements, everything. She had included her historical development analysis of Earth. She had included her assessment of where humanity was on the development curve, and where they were likely to be in another 50 standard cycles if their trajectory continued. She had included, at the end, a single sentence that she had rewritten 17 times before settling on the final version. I believe we have been watching the wrong things about this species for 400 years, and we are now paying the price for that inattention. It caused, in the Inner Council chamber, the closest thing to chaos that body had seen in living memory. Supreme Arbiter Doval of the Dranen was the first to speak, and he did not speak calmly. The Dranen were a tall, ridge-spined species with deep purple skin and 4 upper limbs, 2 primary arms and 2 smaller secondary limbs that they used for fine manipulation. They were proud, formal, and deeply invested in the hierarchy of galactic power. Doval had been Supreme Arbiter for 22 cycles, and in that time, the idea that a Class 7 species on a backwater planet had done something to concern the Inner Council would have struck him as too absurd to even discuss. It was not striking him that way now. "The report is verified?" he demanded, looking at the data scrolling across the chamber's central display. "3 times over," said the data analyst standing to his right. "Ambassador Sassa's sensor readings are consistent across all instruments. There is no measurement error." "Then there is a development error," Doval said. "This species cannot be at this stage. They were Class 7 in the last standard survey." "The last standard survey was 18 cycles ago." Creelan's voice came through the communication link. She was joining the session remotely from her monitoring vessel. "I submitted 9 reports in that time indicating accelerated development. All 9 were filed at standard priority and reviewed by the Bureau of Developing Worlds, not the Council." Doval's secondary arms flexed, the Dranen equivalent of a wince. "The Bureau assessed no anomaly?" "The Bureau assessed each individual development milestone as within the outer range of normal variation," Creelan said. "What the Bureau did not assess was the cumulative effect. Each report was reviewed in isolation. Nobody connected the pattern." Across the chamber, Elder Consortium Representative Velin of the Sul Collective, a species that existed as a distributed intelligence across thousands of individual bodies, each one small and silver-skinned and seemingly identical, spoke with the harmonic resonance that happened when many of those bodies spoke in unison. "We are connecting the pattern now," the Sul said. "What does it show?" Creelan transmitted her analysis. The chamber screens filled with development curves, humanity's actual trajectory plotted against the projected standard curve for a species at their level. The gap between the 2 lines was not subtle. It was not a slight deviation. It was a chasm. The room was quiet for a long moment. Then Fleet Admiral Thrace, 7 of the Marath, a species that had been the galaxy's dominant military power for 800 years, said very quietly, "How long until they achieve spaceflight?" "They already have spaceflight," Creelan said. "Practical spaceflight. Sustained, interstellar capable." Another pause. "At their current development rate, and accounting for the demonstrated willingness to exceed projected resource limits, 30 to 40 standard cycles. Possibly less." Fleet Admiral Thrace, 7 had 4 eyes and a face adapted for deep-sea environments on his home world. Flat, wide, with a skin that could change color to communicate emotion the way human faces changed expression. Right now, his skin had gone the pale silver that meant concern. 30 to 40 cycles, he repeated. "Yes. And in 30 to 40 cycles, what will their weapons technology look like if they continue at this rate?" Creelan let the silence stretch for 3 full seconds before she answered. "I don't know," she said. "And that is what concerns me most." The debate that followed lasted 11 standard hours. It covered everything from immediate quarantine proposals to diplomatic contact recommendations to military contingency plans. Species that had not agreed on a significant policy question in decades found themselves arguing passionately on the same side. Species that were usually allies found themselves in heated disagreement. The Vitharii, Creelan's people, argued for immediate contact. Humanity needed to be brought into the galactic community now, while they were still young and the relationship could be shaped. A species this innovative, this capable, this driven, they would be an invaluable addition to the continuance. The Dranen argued for quarantine. Seal the Sol system, prevent humanity from developing faster by time to assess the threat properly. The Sul Collective argued for observation. Continue monitoring. Gather more data. Don't act rashly. The Marath said almost nothing, which everyone else in the room knew meant they were already running their own assessments independently, and that their assessments were military in nature. In the end, the Inner Council did what councils almost always do when faced with an unprecedented situation. They formed a committee. The Committee on Emerging Civilizations, hastily constituted, chaired by Creelan Sauce herself at her own insistence, was tasked with developing a formal recommendation within 20 standard cycles. 20 cycles. Which, by Earth's calendar, was approximately 140 years. Elder Primus Yella of the Ancient Ones of Corvin, being so old that their species had been spacefaring before Earth's dinosaurs had gone extinct, spoke only once during the entire debate. The ancient ones rarely spoke. When they did, everyone listened. Yella said, "I have watched 6 civilizations reach this stage. 5 of them burned themselves out within 1,000 years. One of them became something that changed the shape of everything that came after." The elder's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried perfectly in the council chamber's acoustics. "I cannot tell you which category these humans belong to. But I can tell you this, the 5 that burned out never surprised anyone. The one that changed everything surprised everyone at every turn from the very beginning. No one spoke for a long time after that. Back on Earth, Sarah Vance was having a beer. She deserved it. It was evening. The desert had cooled to something almost comfortable, and she was sitting on the steps outside the main facility building with Marcus Webb, watching the stars come out one by one in the clear Arizona sky. She had a bottle of beer in one hand and her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and she was, for the first time in what felt like years, not thinking about Atlas 1. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Marcus said. "What?" "I keep thinking about all the things that weapon could be used for that aren't war." Sarah looked at him. "Like what?" "Like, okay, think about it. If you took that technology and scaled it up. Not for kinetic strike. For launch." He sat up straighter, turning to face her. The enthusiasm that came off him in waves sometimes reminded her so much of herself at 26 that it made her chest ache. "Dr. Vance, we just demonstrated that we can accelerate a 14-kilogram object to Mach 28 using electromagnetic induction. That is orbital velocity range. If we solve the G-force problem, and we could solve the G-force problem maybe with longer barrels or staged acceleration, we could use this to launch cargo to orbit. Not people. But cargo. Satellites. Equipment. At a fraction of the cost of rockets." Sarah took a sip of her beer. "You've been thinking about this for a while." "Since about 30 seconds after the projectile hit the impact zone," Marcus admitted. Is that weird? That I watched this weapon fire for the first time and immediately started thinking about how to make it not a weapon." "No," Sarah said. "That's not weird at all." She looked up at the stars. "That's what we do." "What do you mean?" "We build things to solve one problem," she said, "and then we look at what we built and we see 100 other problems it could solve. Every weapon we've ever made has found a peaceful use eventually. Radar. The internet. GPS, nuclear medicine." She paused. "Atlas 1 is a weapon because that's what the funding required and that's what the application demands right now. But the technology," she shook her head. "The technology is bigger than that." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do you think we're alone? In the universe?" Sarah looked at him. It was not the question she expected. "You're asking me that now? Tonight?" "I've been asking it my whole career," he said. "But tonight it feels more real. Like, we just built something that, if someone else in the universe built it for the first time and we were watching, we'd notice. You know? We'd notice." Sarah thought about that. She thought about the vast, dark, star-filled sky above them, and the distances involved, and the probability calculations she had done in graduate school when she was still young enough to find the Fermi paradox charming rather than unnerving. "I think," she said carefully, "that if there is someone out there watching, tonight was a very interesting night for them." She didn't know how right she was. She didn't know that at that very moment, 400 kilometers above her head, a Vitheri monitoring vessel was sending a Priority 1 report to a governing body that had been overseeing galactic civilization for 4,000 years. She didn't know that in 11 hours of debate in a chamber she couldn't have imagined, the most powerful political body in the galaxy had just decided that humanity was, officially, a problem they needed to take seriously. She didn't know any of that. She just drank her beer and looked at the stars and thought about cargo launches and peaceful uses and the long winding road between what a thing is and what it could become. 37 standard cycles passed. On Earth they were 37 years. In those 37 years Atlas 1 was followed by Atlas 2 which was faster. And Atlas 3 which was more accurate. And Atlas 4 which was smaller, compact enough to be transported and deployed in the field, which changed the strategic calculus of ground warfare considerably. And Atlas 5 through Atlas 9, each of which improved on the last in ways that kept Sarah Vance's team working 18-hour days until Sarah Vance was 61 years old and her reading glasses weren't just pushed up on her forehead but were prescription and necessary and she had finally started drinking her coffee hot. Marcus Webb at 43 was running his own research division. He had done what he promised himself that night on the steps. He had developed a cargo launch application for the Atlas technology, and the Atlas Orbital Launch System, better known as AOL, had been placing satellites and supply packages in low Earth orbit for 6 years at a cost per kilogram that made the old rocket industry look at its business models and quietly despair. And humanity, as humanity had always done, looked at what they had built and kept building. The first crewed lunar base was established in year 12 of the Atlas era. The first Mars landing was year 21. The first permanent Mars settlement, small, fragile, expensive, impossibly brave, was year 28. And in year 34, a physicist named Dr. James Okafor at the University of Lagos published a paper that caused a very specific kind of silence in very specific circles. The kind of silence that happens when someone says something that everyone has been thinking but nobody has been brave enough to say out loud. The paper was titled, "On the Theoretical Upper Limits of Electromagnetic Acceleration as Applied to Interstellar Probe Launch." It was, to non-specialists, a dense and technical document. But its conclusion was perfectly clear to anyone who read it. With the right engineering, the Atlas technology could, in theory, accelerate a small probe to a meaningful fraction of the speed of light. Not 5%. Not 1%. 5%. 0.05 c. At that velocity, a probe launched toward Alpha Centauri, the nearest star system to Earth, would arrive in approximately 85 years. Within a human lifetime if you launched it young enough. The paper was downloaded 4 million times in its first week. It was also downloaded once by a Vitheri monitoring relay station, forwarded automatically to Krelin Sassa's office, and placed on her desk at a moment when she was already in the middle of an emergency session with the Inner Council that had been running for 6 hours. She read the abstract. She read the conclusion. She set the paper down very carefully. And then she said, to the room full of Inner Council representatives who were in the middle of arguing about trade policy, "Forgive me for interrupting, but I need to table the current discussion." "Ambassador," Dovell said, with the precise tone of someone who does not appreciate being interrupted. "We are in the middle." "They are planning to build an interstellar probe," Krelin said. The room went quiet. "How long?" Thrace 7 asked. "The paper is theoretical," Krelin said. "But the theory is sound. Based on their demonstrated engineering timeline, 5 to 10 cycles for initial prototype, another 5 for operational capability." She looked around the room. 15 cycles at the outside. Possibly 10. 15 cycles. 105 Earth years. Possibly 10 cycles. 70 Earth years. "They'll be here," said the Sul Collective, and for once their harmonic voices had lost their usual careful calm. "In our space. Within a century." "Yes," Krelin said. "And that is why I have been arguing for 37 cycles that we need to make contact." "Contact is premature," Dovell said. "Contact was premature 30 cycles ago," Krelin said, with a sharpness that was not her usual diplomatic style. "Now it is urgent. The protocol requires." "The protocol," Krelin said, "was written for normal civilizations developing at normal rates. This civilization is not normal." She stood up from her seat, a Vitheri gesture of emphasis, rarely used in formal settings. "I have watched them for 99 standard cycles. I have submitted 481 reports. I have argued every available position in every available forum. And I am telling you, with every year of my professional experience behind me, that if we wait for them to come to us, we will have lost the ability to shape this relationship." The room was quiet. "We need to go to them," Krelin said. "First. Now. While we still can." The committee voted 6 to 1 in favor of initiating contact. The one vote against was Dovell's. He submitted a formal objection that ran to 12 pages and was, by all accounts, very thoroughly argued. It didn't change anything. The contact mission was assigned to a diplomatic vessel, the Vethra's Promise, a sleek, crescent-shaped ship about the size of a city block, and it was given a crew of 47, representing all member species of the continuance. Krelin Sas was appointed as Chief Contact Ambassador. The mission was designated Operation Careful Hand. It was given a timeline of 8 standard cycles, roughly 56 Earth years, to make initial contact, establish a communication framework, and begin preliminary negotiations for Earth's eventual integration into the galactic continuance. The Vethra's Promise launched from its home port in the Dranan system and set a course for the Sol system. It arrived at the edge of the solar system, at a point just beyond the orbit of what humans called Neptune, 42 days later by Earth reckoning. And then it stopped, because the contact team had made an error in their planning. A simple, embarrassing, completely avoidable error. They had not accounted for how much Earth had advanced in the years while they were arguing. The object they had not expected to encounter was designated by Earth's tracking systems as Sentinel-7, one of a network of deep space monitoring stations that humanity had been quietly deploying across the outer solar system for the past 12 years. Sentinel-7 was the size of a small car, solar-powered, equipped with passive sensors, and designed to detect anything unusual moving through the outer system. Unusual things were, at that moment, moving through the outer system. Sentinel-7 detected the Vethra's promise 18 seconds after the ship dropped out of FTL transit at Neptune's orbital range. The detection data was transmitted to Earth in 4 hours, the light travel time for that distance, and arrived at the Solar System Monitoring Center in Houston at 3:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning. The overnight analyst on duty was a 29-year-old named Ryan Park, who had a master's degree in astrophysics, 3 years of experience tracking asteroids and space debris, and a cup of coffee that was, as of that moment, the most important thing in his life. Ryan looked at the Sentinel-7 data. He looked at it again. He pulled up the imaging data and cross-referenced it with the spectral analysis and the motion tracking and the thermal signature and the electromagnetic emission profile. He looked at all of that data for 7 minutes. Then he picked up his phone and called his supervisor. "Dr. Chin," he said when the groggy voice answered on the third ring. "Sorry to wake you, but I have a contact report from Sentinel-7 that I need a second pair of eyes on." "Contact report?" Dr. Chen's voice sharpened immediately. "What kind of contact?" Ryan looked at the screens again. At the shape hanging beyond Neptune's orbit, crescent-shaped, metallic, absolutely still, emitting no signals but reading hot in the infrared range in a pattern consistent with active propulsion recently terminated. "The kind," Ryan said carefully, "that I think is above my pay grade." What followed was 8 hours of the most controlled pandemonium in the history of humanity's space program. Dr. Chin called the center director. The center director called NASA's administrator. The administrator called the Department of Defense liaison. The DoD liaison called the Secretary of Defense. The Secretary of Defense called the President. By 11 a.m., there were 47 people in the Situation Room of the White House, and the President of the United States, President Eleanor Marsh, 62, former governor, former senator, former military officer, a woman who was known for 2 things: her extraordinary calm under pressure and her extraordinary directness when calm was not sufficient, was looking at the Sentinel-7 data on the main screen. She looked at it for 30 seconds. Then she said, "Is this real?" "Our best analysis says yes, Madam President," said the NASA administrator. "The object is real, it is artificial, and it did not originate in our solar system." "How confident are we?" "On the reality of the object, 98%. On the artificial origin, 89%. On the non-solar system origin, a pause. The propulsion signature analysis shows no residue consistent with any human technology. The material spectral analysis shows alloys and compounds that are not in our database. And the shape," another pause. "The shape is not consistent with natural formation." President Marsh looked at the image on the screen. At the crescent. At the clean, deliberate curve of it. "It's a ship," she said. "Yes, ma'am. We believe so." "Is it armed?" "We cannot determine that from current data." "Is it communicating?" "No active transmissions detected." The president looked around the room. At the faces of her advisors, some pale, some flushed, all of them operating at the edge of their training and experience. "Here is what we're going to do," she said. "We are not panicking. We are not making any public statements for the next 24 hours. We are going to observe, we are going to analyze, and we are going to decide on a response that is thoughtful and deliberate." She paused. "We are going to handle this the way we handle anything we have never encountered before. We gather information. We think carefully. And then we act." She looked at the NASA administrator. "Get me Dr. Sarah Vance." Sarah Vance was 61 years old and had been retired for 8 months. She was, at the moment the call came, gardening in her backyard in Tucson, Arizona, with dirt on her hands and the Arizona sun on her back and a genuine, unprecedented sense of peace that she had been waiting her whole career to feel. The peace lasted until she checked her phone and saw 14 missed calls from numbers she recognized. She called back. She listened. She was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, "Give me 4 hours to get there." She hung up. She looked at her garden for one moment, at the tomatoes she had been tending, at the herbs in their pots, at the small, ordinary, beautiful life she had just started to build for herself. She went inside and packed a bag. Sarah arrived at the Houston facility at 4:30 p.m. and walked into the Situation Room at 4:47 p.m., still in the clothes she had been gardening in. Nobody mentioned it. She looked at the data for 2 hours without speaking. She looked at the shape. She looked at the propulsion signature. She looked at the material spectral analysis. She looked at the motion tracking, the precise, controlled way the object had come out of what appeared to be faster-than-light transit at the exact edge of the gravitational influence of Neptune's orbit, as if it knew where the boundary was and had been careful not to cross it. As if it had been courteous. It stopped at Neptune's orbit, she said. Yes, said Dr. Chin, who was sitting beside her. Why? We don't know. I think we do. Sarah leaned back in her chair. It stopped there because that's where our solar system properly begins. It stopped there because it knew where our space started and it didn't enter without permission. The room was quiet for a moment. That's a significant interpretation, said the National Security Advisor. It's the interpretation that fits the data best, Sarah said. If this vessel's people have been watching us, and I think they have, based on the precision of this approach, then they know a lot about us. They know where we are, what we've built, and they've chosen to approach from the outer system rather than just appearing near Earth. That's not random. She paused. That's intentional. That's consideration. Or it's a tactical position, said the Secretary of Defense. It could be both, Sarah admitted. But a hostile vessel wouldn't wait 12 hours without communicating. A hostile vessel would act. She looked at the data again. They're waiting for us. What are they waiting for? President Marsh asked. For us to say something, Sarah said. For us to respond. We don't know how to communicate with them. Not yet. Sarah looked up. But we built Atlas 1. We figured out the capacitor problem, the thermal management problem, the barrel geometry problem, and the propulsion problem, and we did all of that without any help from anyone. She looked around the room. We can figure out how to say hello. The communication team that assembled over the next 72 hours was the most extraordinary group of people ever convened in one place on Earth. Linguists, mathematicians, physicists, cryptographers, SETI researchers who had been waiting their entire lives for this moment and were now experiencing a mixture of total vindication and absolute terror. Psychologists, anthropologists, a philosopher from MIT who specialized in the concept of universal meaning, and Sarah Vance, who had no formal training in any of those fields but who had built Atlas 1 and had spent the last 37 years turning impossible problems into solved ones, and whom President Marsh had quietly designated as the team lead, because you could have all the specialists in the world but you also needed someone who knew how to get things done. The problem they had to solve was this. How do you say something meaningful to a completely unknown intelligence, when you have no shared language, no shared context, no shared anything except the physical laws of the universe? The answer the team arrived at after 48 hours of debate was mathematics. Specifically, prime numbers. It was an old SETI idea, almost embarrassingly old, first proposed in the 1950s. But it had a logic to it that was genuinely universal. Prime numbers are prime because of arithmetic, and arithmetic is arithmetic everywhere in the universe. No matter what species you are, no matter what world you come from, if you have the capacity to build a starship, you have the capacity to recognize a prime number sequence. They used Atlas 9, the most precise version of the system installed at a facility in Nevada, and they pointed it at a frequency in the radio spectrum and they began to pulse. 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13, 17. Not projectiles. Not anything physical. Just radio pulses. Mathematical poetry. Then they waited. On the Vethra's promise, Creelan Sauce was in the middle of a tense conversation with her second officer about the fact that they had been detected much faster than anyone had anticipated, and the contact protocol was therefore already behind schedule, when the alert came in from the signal monitoring station. Ambassador. Her communications officer, a young Dranan named Shurel, turned from his station with an expression she couldn't quite read. We are receiving a transmission from the planet's surface. Creelan stopped mid-sentence. What kind of transmission? Mathematical. Radio frequency. Shurel paused. They are transmitting prime numbers. The communication room went silent. Creelan crossed to Shurel's station and looked at the incoming signal. At the clean, steady pulses. 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, 11. How long before we received this after our arrival? She asked. Approximately 34 hours. 34 hours. They had been here for 34 hours and humanity had already detected them, organized a response, designed a communication approach and started transmitting. Creelan closed all four of her eyes for a moment. When she opened them she said, respond. With what, Ambassador? With the next prime number in their sequence, she said. Then continue the sequence from there. Show them we understand. Shirul looked uncertain. Ambassador, the protocol says our first communication should be. Shirul, Krillin said gently. They said hello. We say hello back. That's what first contact is. The response arrived at Houston 4 hours later, the light travel time from Neptune's orbit to Earth. Prime numbers. Continuing directly from where the Earth team had stopped. The communication room erupted. Not in cheering, in the specific, electric, barely contained energy of people who have been trained their whole careers to remain professional and are struggling, in this one specific moment, to remember why. Sarah Vance watched the numbers come in on the screen and felt something she had not expected to feel. She felt like crying. Not from fear. Not from joy exactly. From something that didn't quite have a name, something that lived between wonder and grief and gratitude and terror. She thought about her father. About the bike. About the moment when she realized she was riding it herself. She thought about what it meant to reach out into a universe you couldn't see or understand, and to have something reach back. She pressed her hand flat against the screen where the prime numbers were scrolling. "Hi," she whispered, so quietly that no one in the room could hear her. Then she straightened up, pushed her reading glasses up on her forehead and said in her normal voice, "Okay. Let's figure out what to say next." The strangers. What followed was, by any measure, the strangest and most extraordinary 6 months in human history. The Vethra's promise stayed at Neptune's orbital range. The Earth team stayed in Houston. And between them, across the light minutes of empty space, a conversation grew. It started with mathematics. Prime numbers giving way to geometric sequences giving way to physical constants. The speed of light expressed in pulses that could only mean one thing. The gravitational constant. Planck's constant. Numbers that were the same everywhere in the universe. Then physics gave way to something more complex. The Vethra's promise began transmitting visual data. Simple, geometric images first, then more complex representations. The Earth team received them and sent back their own. It was slow. It was painstaking. It was an act of collective translation that required hundreds of people working around the clock and produced results that were, at first, almost laughably limited. But it grew. Over 3 months, the two sides built what could only be called a pigeon. A shared, improvised language of signals and images and mathematical relationships that allowed them to exchange, roughly, concepts. Not sentences. Not full ideas. Concepts. Objects. Numbers. Basic verbs. Sarah ran the Earth team with the same approach she had used on Atlas. 1. Break the problem into pieces, solve each piece, don't wait for perfect before you proceed to good enough. She drove the team hard and cared for them equally hard, and when someone had a breakthrough they would sometimes find she had left a note on their door that simply said good work in her cramped handwriting, which everyone agreed was worth more than a formal commendation. At the end of month 4, the Vethra's promise transmitted something that stopped the Earth team cold. It was a map. Not of the solar system, they had exchanged those already. A map of something much larger. A map that showed, in painstaking schematic detail, hundreds of star systems, dozens of inhabited worlds, with lines of connection between them that could only mean communication or political relationship, and at the center of it all, a symbol that had appeared in the alien transmissions before but never in this context. The symbol for their governing body. The symbol for the galactic continuance. Sarah stared at the map for a long time. "They're not just explorers," Marcus said from beside her. He was 52 now, silver at his temples, still perpetually enthusiastic in a way that Sarah had long since stopped finding exhausting and started finding essential. "They're representatives." "Yes," Sarah said. "Of an interstellar government. That's what this looks like." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "How many species?" Sarah counted the inhabited world symbols on the map. She counted twice to be sure. 47, she said. The number landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water, and the ripples moved outward and didn't stop. The political implications were, to put it mildly, significant. Every government on Earth had been quietly briefed on the contact situation within the first week. The briefings had been given under strict confidentiality protocols, which had lasted approximately 9 days before someone leaked to a journalist in Sao Paulo, after which the confidentiality protocols became somewhat academic. The public reaction had been, broadly, not what anyone had feared. There had been no mass panic. There had been fear. Yes, certainly fear, the deep, primal kind that lives in the back of the brain and doesn't answer to rational argument. But there had been something else too, something that the sociologists and psychologists who spent the following months studying it struggled to categorize precisely. The closest they came was to call it recognition. As if, on some level, humanity had been waiting for this. As if, having looked at the stars for their entire existence as a species, having told stories about what was out there, having pointed telescopes at every wavelength of light, having sent radio signals and space probes and eventually astronauts into the dark, they had always assumed, on some level, that there was something there. And the fact that the universe was not, after all, empty, was frightening and wonderful and enormous, but it was not, in the end, a surprise. The surprise was what came next. President Eleanor Marsh stood in the Rose Garden of the White House and addressed the world. She was 63 now. She had been dealing with this situation for 8 months. She looked tired in the way that only people who are carrying enormous weights can look tired. Not broken, not defeated, but profoundly, bone-deep exhausted from the effort of carrying something without dropping it. She spoke for 12 minutes. She talked about what they knew: the vessel, the communication, the map, the 47 species. She talked about what they didn't know: intentions, capabilities, history, culture. She talked about what they were doing: the ongoing communication efforts, the diplomatic team being assembled, the security protocols that were in place. And then she said something that Sarah Vance, watching from Houston, had not expected. She said, "We are not frightened. We are ready." She said it simply, without theatrics, without the kind of patriotic swelling that such moments often invited. She said it as a statement of fact. "We have always been the kind of species that goes toward the unknown rather than away from it," she said. "We have always been the kind of people who look at something enormous and decide to understand it rather than hide from it. We did not build a railgun because we wanted war. We built it because we wanted to see how far we could reach. We did not go to the moon because the moon was safe. We went because it was there." She paused. "Whatever is out there, whoever has come to our solar system and is waiting at the edge of it, we will meet them with that same spirit. Curious, careful, unafraid." She looked into the camera. "We are ready," she said again. Watching in the monitoring vessel 4 light hours away, Creelan Sauce received the broadcast on a 12-second delay and sat with it for a long time. She had spent 99 cycles watching this species. She had filed 481 reports. She had argued for contact with every resource at her disposal. And now, watching this human leader speak those words in that simple, direct, unadorned way, "We are ready," Creelan felt something she recognized with some surprise as admiration. She had been expecting to be the one to teach humanity about the galaxy. She was beginning to suspect that the teaching might go both ways. The meeting place was chosen after 3 weeks of negotiation conducted through the Pidgin language. Not Earth. Too much of a home field advantage for humanity, which both sides apparently agreed was a factor worth considering. Not the Vethra's promise. Too much of a home field advantage for the continuance. What they settled on was humanity's Mars settlement, Port Ares, the sprawling pressure dome complex in the Hellas Planitia basin that housed, at that time, a permanent population of 214 people and a temporary population of however many scientists, engineers and journalists happened to be there at any given moment. It was not a neutral location in the strictest sense. It was, after all, a human installation on a human-claimed world. But there was something about the choice that felt right to both sides. Mars was not Earth. It was frontier. It was new. It was a place that humanity had come to precisely because they wanted to see what was beyond the familiar. It was the right place to meet strangers. The Vethra's promise entered the inner solar system with every sensor on Earth and Mars tracking its every move, and it came in slowly and obviously and with every active system broadcasting clearly, the galactic equivalent, Sarah had come to understand, of arriving with your hands visible. It settled into orbit around Mars and deployed a smaller shuttle craft, crescent-shaped like the mother ship, about the size of a house, which descended to Port Ares and landed in the main docking bay with a precision that made the Port Ares traffic controllers quietly appreciate whoever had programmed that approach. Sarah Vance was there. She had been named, after extensive governmental deliberation, as Earth's primary contact representative. Not a diplomat in the traditional sense. She had no diplomatic training, no formal credentials in international relations. But she knew Atlas I. She knew how to solve impossible problems. She knew how to meet the unknown with steady hands. She was also, as the president had noted privately, someone that people trusted. There was something about Sarah that communicated, to everyone who encountered her, a fundamental seriousness. Not grimness, not severity, but the quality of a person who meant what she said and said what she meant and would not, under any circumstances, pretend otherwise. She was 72 now. Her hair was fully white, cut short and neat. Her reading glasses were permanently on her face. She walked with a cane following a knee surgery 2 years earlier, which she found annoying but had adjusted to. She wore a navy suit and her usual expression of focused, alert calm. Standing beside her was Marcus, 52, silver-templed, still wearing the slightly too excited expression of someone who has spent 30 years waiting for this moment and cannot quite believe it has arrived. And behind them, a team of 30, linguists, scientists, diplomats, security personnel, and one philosopher from MIT who had not said much but whose presence Sarah found quietly reassuring. The shuttle hatch opened, and Creelan stepped out. What Sarah saw was something she had been trying to prepare herself for. Creelan was taller than a human, nearly 7 feet, with a slate-blue skin for narrow eyes and long translucent-tipped fingers that were the standard Vitherii morphology. She wore a garment that seemed to shift color slightly as she moved. Not dramatically, just a subtle shimmer that Sarah would later learn was a formal diplomatic variation of normal Vitherii dress. Behind her came 3 others, 2 Vitherii and 1 creature that was smaller, silver-skinned, apparently one body of the Sul collective. What Sarah had not prepared herself for was the expression on Creelan's face. She didn't know Vitherii facial expressions. She had studied them in the data they had exchanged, but theory and practice were not the same. What she read in Creelan's face, in the arrangement of those 4 narrow eyes and the slight tension around the mouth, what she read there, without certainty but with strong intuition, was something she recognized. The expression of someone who has been waiting a very long time for something that matters. Sarah walked forward. She stopped at a distance she hoped was respectful, close enough for presence, far enough for space. She said in the pidgin they had built together over 6 months, "Welcome." And then in English, "We are glad you came." The translation delay was brief. Creelan had a device at her collar that processed the pidgin and fed her the meaning. And then Creelan said something in Vitherii, and the translation came back through the interpreter system, and the words were, "I have been watching your world for 107 of your years. I am glad to finally see it from here." Sarah blinked. 107 years, she said. "Since your year 1918 by your calendar." Creelan's 4 eyes were fixed on Sarah with an attention that was, she would later describe, like being looked at by someone who had been trying to understand you for a very long time and was finally getting the chance to check their conclusions. "I have submitted 512 reports about your species." 512, Sarah repeated. "You are more interesting in person," Creelan said. It was the least expected thing anyone could have said, and it did something remarkable. It made Sarah laugh. A real laugh, sudden and genuine and warm. And then Marcus was laughing too because he was Marcus and he couldn't help it, and several of the team behind Sarah were smiling, and the tension in the docking bay, the enormous, impacted, history of the world tension that had been building for 8 months, broke like ice on a spring river. Creelan's 4 eyes shifted in a way that her later would explain was the Vitherii equivalent of a smile. "I am told," Creelan said, "that your sense of humor is very developed. My reports mention this." "Did they?" Sarah said, still smiling. "Frequently," Creelan said. "I found it difficult to convey to my superiors why it was significant. They do not always understand why a species that laughs in the middle of crisis is more resilient than one that does not." Sarah looked at her. "Do you understand it?" Creelan considered the question with the kind of careful seriousness that Sarah was already learning was characteristic of her. "I think," Creelan said, "that I am beginning to." The formal meeting lasted 4 days. On the first day they exchanged histories. Humanities as comprehensively as could be assembled in the time available, which was not very comprehensive but was honest. The continuances in broad outline, 47 species, 4,000 years of recorded history, a governing structure that was complex enough that Sarah requested a follow-up session specifically to understand it properly. On the second day they discussed technology. This conversation was the one that produced, in the continuance representatives, the expression that Sarah would privately describe as the face of someone who has just learned something they really should have already known. Atlas 9 specifications were shared. The AOL launch system. The Mars Propulsion Network. The theoretical interstellar probe paper by Dr. Okafor. The Sul Collective Representative, a body named V3 by the delegation's designation system, one of thousands of bodies that shared the same distributed intelligence, had no face to make expressions within the human sense. But it went very, very still in a way that communicated clearly enough. "You developed this electromagnetic acceleration technology," V3 said, "in 7 years?" "The initial prototype in 7 years," Sarah said. "The operational system in 12. And the theoretical work on interstellar application. 34 years after the first prototype." V3 was still for a moment. For context, the Marith, who are the continuance's primary military power, developed their equivalent of this technology in 43 standard cycles. That is approximately 300 Earth years. Sarah made a careful effort not to look at Marcus. She knew if she looked at Marcus, she would see the expression he made when he was trying not to look impressed with himself, and it would not help the diplomatic atmosphere. "We had a lot of very smart people working on it," she said. "We have observed that," V3 said. "You also have a great many people working on many things simultaneously." "We have 8 billion people," Sarah said. "Statistically, there are a lot of smart ones. The Marith have 12 billion and they do not develop at your rate." Sarah thought about that. "What's the difference?" V3 was quiet for a moment. "That," it said, "is what we would very much like to understand." On the third day they discussed politics. This was where it got complicated. The continuance's membership process was comprehensive, standardized, and designed for species that developed on the standard curve. It involved a provisional period of 50 standard cycles, during which the new species was monitored, their political stability assessed, their technology cataloged, and their potential contribution to the continuance evaluated. The process had never been completed in less than 50 cycles. Ever. In 4,000 years. Creelan explained all of this clearly and then said, "Given your demonstrated development rate, however, the Committee on Emerging Civilizations is prepared to recommend an accelerated process." "How accelerated?" Sarah asked. 20 cycles, Creelan said. Sarah did the math. 20 standard cycles. 140 Earth years. "So Earth's grandchildren negotiate the final terms," she said. "Your children may live to see it," Creelan said. "The process once begun." "Creelan," Sarah said, using the name because they had agreed on the first day to use names rather than titles. "We sent a crewed mission to Mars in 21 years. We built a permanent settlement in 28. We detected your ship in 18 seconds. She held up a hand before Creelan could respond. "I understand the process. I understand why it exists and why it's the length it is. I'm not asking to skip it." She paused. "I'm asking if the process is flexible enough to reflect what we actually are." Creelan was quiet for a moment. "That," she said, "is something I will take back to the council." On the fourth day they said goodbye. Formally, with ceremony, with the kind of ritual gravity that even humans, who had been doing this for 4,000 fewer years than their counterparts, managed to bring to the occasion. There were documents signed. Symbols exchanged. A handshake, four-fingered and deliberate, between Sarah and Creelan that every camera in the docking bay captured simultaneously. And there was a moment at the very end, that Sarah would never talk about publicly but would tell Marcus about later, sitting on the steps outside their temporary quarters at Port Ares, watching the Martian stars. At the very end, as Creelan was about to step back into the shuttle, she stopped. She turned back. She looked at Sarah for a long moment with all four of her narrow eyes. "May I ask you something?" she said. "Of course," Sarah said. "In my reports," Creelan said, "I have been trying for 107 years to explain what is different about your species. Why you develop faster. Why you exceed the models. Why you," she paused, searching for the word. "Why you persist. Even when logic says you should stop. Even when the limits are real." She paused again. "Do you know? Do you have an answer for that?" Sarah thought about it. She thought about her father and the bike. About the moment she realized the limits were in her head. About 7 years in a desert building a gun that everyone said was too big and too powerful and too expensive. She thought about 8 billion people on a blue planet pointing their faces at the sky. "We're afraid of stopping," she said. "More afraid of stopping than of what's next." She paused. "Every limit we've ever found, we test it first. Every boundary, we walk up to it and knock. Sometimes the boundary holds. Sometimes it doesn't." She looked at Creelan. "We don't always know in advance which kind it is. So we just keep knocking." Creelan was still for a long moment. Then she said, "I am going to write a 657th report about your species." "What will it say?" "It will say," Creelan said, "that I think the continuance has been studying the wrong question. We have been asking what humans are. We should have been asking what they might become." She stepped back into the shuttle. The hatch closed. Sarah watched it go. 8 months after the Mars meeting, something happened that nobody had planned for. It started with a senator. Senator David Hart of Texas was 67 years old, politically experienced, and possessed of a deep, genuine suspicion of anything he hadn't personally evaluated with his own hands. He was not a bad man. He was not an ignorant man. He was a man shaped by a lifetime of operating in a world where trust was a transaction and information was power, and he had looked at the Mars meeting and the communication protocols and the emerging membership discussions and arrived at a question that he felt nobody was asking loudly enough. "What are they getting?" he said in a closed Senate hearing that was promptly leaked to every major news outlet within 48 hours. "We're sharing our technology, our location, our development history, our capabilities, and what are we getting in return? A pat on the head and a 140-year waiting room?" The question landed in the public discourse like a stone in still water. And the ripples were not always comfortable. Sarah was called back to Washington. She sat in a Senate hearing room and looked at 22 senators and answered their questions with the same directness and precision she brought to everything. "What has the continuance offered us in concrete terms?" Senator Hart asked. "The acknowledgement of our sovereignty," Sarah said. "Formal recognition that the Sol system is human space. Assurance of non-interference in our internal development. And preliminary access to the Continuance Trade Network, which represents 47 civilizations and is the largest economic structure in this section of the galaxy." "That's a lot of words," Senator Hart said. "What has the continuance offered us in technology?" "Technology transfer is not part of the preliminary agreement," Sarah said. "Why not?" "Because the preliminary agreement is a framework for a relationship, not the relationship itself. Technology transfer comes in later stages of the membership process. A 140-year membership process. We are negotiating the timeline," Sarah said. "The framework is flexible." "It didn't sound flexible when you explained it," the senator said. "Senator, when I built Atlas 1, the conventional wisdom said the power problem was unsolvable. It wasn't." She held his gaze. "When I told the engineering team we were going to build a 2-kilometer barrel in a desert in Arizona, they told me the logistics were impossible. They weren't." Pause. "I have been in negotiations with 47 alien species for 8 months. The framework seems rigid. It won't be. Because we will make it not be." Senator Hart looked at her for a long moment. "Dr. Vance," he said, "what happens if they decide they don't want us?" Sarah looked at him. "They came to us," she said. "They crossed the galaxy to do it. They had 100 years to decide they didn't want us and they came anyway." She leaned forward slightly. "The question isn't whether they want us. The question is whether we can handle being wanted." The hearing room was quiet. "What does that mean?" the senator asked, more quietly now. "It means," Sarah said, "that we've spent our entire history assuming we were alone in the universe. We built that assumption into everything, our politics, our economics, our sense of who we are. We are the main characters in our own story because we thought we were the only characters." She paused. "Now we know we're not. And that changes everything. Not because the aliens are a threat, but because we have to decide as a species who we are when we're not the only ones in the room." She paused again. "That is the hardest thing we have ever been asked to do. And we haven't done it yet." The hearing continued for another 4 hours. When it was over, Sarah walked out into the May afternoon and called Marcus. "How'd it go?" he asked. "We'll be fine," she said. "How do you know?" "Because we always are," she said. Eventually. Back on the Vethra's promise, Creelin was having her own version of the same conversation. The Inner Council had reviewed her report from the Mars meeting and had questions. Many questions. The Dranan had questions about security. The Marith had questions about weapons. The Sul Collective had questions about economic modeling. The Ancient Ones of Corvin had, as usual, said almost nothing, which everyone interpreted in whatever way was most convenient to their own position. The question that occupied Creelin most was the one from Fleet Admiral Thrace 7. "The Railgun," Thrace 7 said, his skin shifting to the pale silver of concern. "Atlas 9. We have the specifications. We've modeled the system." He paused. "If this technology is scaled, if they do what the Okafor paper suggests is theoretically possible, what does that look like in 30 cycles?" Creelin had spent a month running this analysis. She shared her projections. The room, which had been dealing with the numbers for 8 months and thought it had gotten used to them, went very quiet. "They would have launch capability to any point in this sector of the galaxy," Thrace 7 said. "Theoretically," Creelin said. "Probe launch capability. Not crewed. But the technology." "Yes." She met his eyes. "In 30 cycles with their development rate, the technology extrapolation suggests they could threaten any vessel in continuance space with a kinetic strike from a ground-based installation in the Sol system." "And they would know we were there," said the Dranan representative. "They already know we're there," Creelin said. "They detected us in 18 seconds with equipment we did not know existed." She paused. This is not a species that can be managed by information control or strategic positioning. They will find out whatever they want to find out. The only question is whether they find it as members of the continuance or outside it. You're arguing, Dovell said, that membership protects us from them. I'm arguing that membership protects everyone from the alternative, Creelan said. The alternative being two civilizations developing in the same galactic neighborhood, independently, with no framework for relationship and significant capability for mutual harm. She looked around the table. We have had that situation before. Twice. The continuance exists partly because of what happened both times. The room was quiet. File your recommendation, Ambassador, Dovell said finally. I already have, Creelan said. I filed it 6 months ago. I am simply waiting for the Council to read it. Year 41 of the Atlas era. 4 years after the Mars meeting, and the negotiations were ongoing, slow, careful, occasionally frustrating, always fascinating. The membership timeline had been reduced from 20 cycles to 12. Still longer than Sarah wanted, still shorter than Dovell wanted, which probably meant it was about right. Sarah was 75. She had retired from the direct negotiation team 2 years earlier. Her knee was no longer cooperating and the travel to Port Aries had become genuinely difficult. But she remained on the advisory council and read every briefing document that crossed Marcus's desk, which was a lot of them. Marcus was 56 and had aged into someone who looked startlingly like the kind of person who runs the most important diplomatic mission in human history, which was exactly what he was. And then, 4 years after the Mars meeting, in a context that had nothing to do with the negotiations, something happened. On the far edge of the solar system, beyond Pluto, in the scattered disk of debris that marked the outermost boundary of the Sun's gravitational influence, Sentinel-19 detected something. Not a ship. Something else. Something moving very fast and not slowing down. The object was approximately 3 meters in length, irregularly shaped, with a metallic composition that matched nothing in the human database. It was not on a natural orbital trajectory. It was moving at a velocity that was consistent with having been launched, deliberately with significant energy, from a direction that, when the trajectory was traced backward, aligned with a star system 18 light-years away. A star system that was home to no continuance member species. A star system that contained, according to continuance records, a civilization that the continuance had been monitoring for approximately 200 cycles. A civilization that had been, until very recently, entirely pre-industrial. A civilization that had apparently just fired something at the Sol system. The object arrived at Earth's orbital path at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, and Ryan Park, now in his 50s, no longer an overnight analyst but the director of the Solar System Monitoring Center, was woken up by a call from his own overnight analyst, and the call had a quality of barely controlled panic that he recognized from 30 years earlier. "What is it?" he said. "Director Park," the analyst said. "We have an inbound." The object passed through the inner solar system at 847 kilometers per second and did not hit anything. Whether by accident or design, it missed Earth by approximately 2 million kilometers, close in astronomical terms but not threatening. It continued outward, gradually slowing under the influence of the Sun's gravity, and eventually the tracking teams confirmed it would exit the solar system entirely without impacting anything. It was not a weapon. Or if it was a very bad one. The analysis team, working around the clock for 72 hours, arrived at a conclusion that was simultaneously obvious and extraordinary. It was a probe. A primitive, roughly constructed, clearly first-generation probe. The same engineering signatures that Atlas I had left behind. The same evidence of electromagnetic acceleration, of vast energy channeled into a projectile, were present in the object's composition and trajectory. The math was unmistakable. Someone else had built a railgun. Someone 18 light-years away had looked at the physics, done the work and fired into the night. The object had not been aimed at Earth specifically. The targeting precision was too low for that. It had been aimed at the solar system, at the bright, warm, electromagnetically active region around the Sun. At the most visible thing in the neighborhood. It was a shot in the dark. It was hello. The emergency session convened at Port Aries included both Earth representatives and the full Vethra's promised diplomatic team. It was the first joint session convened outside the scheduled negotiation calendar, and its establishment was itself a small milestone, an acknowledgement that the relationship had already become one in which emergencies could be handled together. The star system is designation T7714 in continuance records, Creelan said, pulling up the data. The species is designated Class 6 developing world. We have been monitoring them for 203 cycles. Class 6, Marcus said. Meaning they're behind Earth's development level when you first cataloged us? Significantly behind, Creelan said. Or so we believed. She paused. We appear to have made a similar error to the one we made with Earth. The room was quiet. They fired a railgun, Marcus said. Yes. First generation. Like Atlas, 1. Roughly comparable in energy output. Different in design. They appear to have used chemical propellant to augment the electromagnetic acceleration, which is an approach we have not seen before. It's less efficient but achieves a similar result with lower electrical infrastructure requirements. She paused. It's actually quite clever. They're not alone? One of the Earth security representatives asked. That is what we do not know, Creelan said. T-7714 has 2 habitable bodies. The probe was launched from the larger one. Whether the smaller has a population. They fired at us, the security representative pressed. At the solar system. They fired into the neighborhood, Marcus said. The precision isn't there for targeting. He looked at Creelan. Same thing we would have done if we'd had this technology and no way to know anyone was listening. If they have a railgun, what else do they have? The security rep asked. We don't know, Creelan said. The same way we didn't know what Earth had 18 cycles ago. Marcus leaned back in his chair. He thought about Atlas, 1. About the night he'd sat on the steps with Sarah and asked her if she thought they were alone in the universe. About the way she'd said that if someone was watching, tonight was an interesting night for them. We should go say hello, he said. The room looked at him. We, humanity, I mean. Not the continuance. He looked at Creelan. We understand what this is. What it means to fire your first railgun and not know if anyone heard it. He looked around the room. We're 18 months away from operational interstellar probe capability. Let us be the ones to make first contact. The continuance has a protocol, one of the council representatives began. The continuance protocol, Marcus said carefully, didn't work very well with us by your own account. He was not being unkind. He had learned Creelan's candor from years of working alongside her. Let us try. Humanity to whoever they are. First generation railgun to first generation railgun. He paused. We speak that language. Creelan looked at him for a long time. Then she said, I will take it to the council. Sarah heard about the decision 3 days later, in a briefing document that Marcus sent with a voice note attached. The voice note said, We're going. Year 43. Full probe mission. I told them we could do it and you would have told me to say that. Call me when you've read the briefing. She called him. You volunteered humanity for first contact with an alien civilization, she said. Our second alien civilization, he said. We have experience. She was quiet for a moment. Are we ready? No, Marcus said. But you told me once that we never are and we do it anyway. She thought about that. Who's leading the probe mission? She asked. I was thinking a young physicist named Alicia Torres, he said. Jamie's daughter. She's 31, she's brilliant, and she grew up listening to her mother talk about the day Atlas, 1 fired. Sarah remembered Jamie Torres, the targeting specialist from the original Atlas team. She was in her 80s now, retired, living in New Mexico. Does Jamie know? She asked. I called her first, Marcus said. She cried. Sarah was quiet again. The probe design, she said finally. We need to. I know, Marcus said. I know. I'm already on it. Pause. Sarah? What? We're going to be okay, right? All of this, everything that's happening, we're going to come through it? Sarah thought about that for a long moment. She thought about Atlas, 1 and the crater in the desert and the dust hanging in the Arizona sky. She thought about prime numbers scrolling across a screen at 3 a.m. She thought about Creelan standing in a Martian docking bay saying you are more interesting in person. She thought about an alien probe tumbling through the solar system. Primitive, rough, miraculous, fired from 18 light-years away by someone who didn't know anyone was listening but fired anyway because they had to. Because that's what you do when you're that kind of being. You knock on the universe's door. We're going to be better than okay, she said. We're going to be what we've always been. What's that? A species, she said, that doesn't stop. Dr. Alicia Torres was 31 years old and had grown up in Houston, Texas, in a house full of space. Her mother Jamie's career had filled the shelves with models and manuals and the specific kind of memorabilia that comes from being present at historic moments. Photographs of the first Atlas test firing, signed copies of Dr. Okafor's theoretical paper, a framed printout of the prime number transmission from the Vethers Promise that Alicia had grown up thinking of as wallpaper. She had a doctorate in electromagnetic propulsion from MIT and a secondary specialization in xenocommunications, a field that had not existed as a discipline 10 years earlier but now had its own department in most major research universities, thanks to the ongoing conversations with the continuance diplomatic team. She was also, by all accounts, someone who had gotten her mother's targeting specialist precision and her father's absolute refusal to be intimidated by the scale of a problem. Her father was an architect who had designed 2 of Port Ares's pressure domes, and he approached very large structures with the same calm that she approached very large uncertainties. When Marcus offered her the mission, she said yes before he finished explaining it. When she called her mother to tell her, Jamie Torres cried. Alicia did not. She was saving that for later when no one was watching, but she held the phone very tightly and listened to her mother's voice break a little and thought about all the history that had led to this moment. Your grandmother would have loved this, Jamie said. She would have, Alicia agreed. She also would have told you to double-check your power calculations. Alicia laughed. I have. 3 times? 4, Alicia said. Pause. Then Jamie said, Ab SYMJHYB Lucelo Beta. It was Urdu. Her grandmother had spoken Urdu, and Jamie had learned enough to use it with Alicia growing up. Take me with you, child. You're coming with me, Mom, Alicia said. Every calculation I've ever run, you're in it. The probe, designated First Knock, launched in year 43 of the Atlas era. It was not large. It was not fancy. It was, by the standards of what humanity had been building, relatively modest. A 3-meter cylinder of carefully selected instruments, communication equipment, a camera array, a chemical propellant stage for course correction, and an electromagnetic launch stage that was, at its heart, a direct descendant of Atlas I. It was launched from a modified Atlas installation on the Martian surface, the first Atlas system to be specifically constructed for orbital launch rather than tactical application, and it left the inner solar system at a velocity of approximately 0.003 c. Much slower than the theoretical Okafor ceiling, but fast enough to reach T7714 in a travel time that was, by galactic standards, quite short. In approximately 6,000 years by Earth's calendar. Which was not short by any human measure. But the mission was not to arrive. The mission was to transmit. For the first 4 light years of its journey, the range over which its communication systems could maintain coherence, First Knock would broadcast. It would broadcast mathematics, prime numbers, physical constants. Then, as the shared communication protocols developed with the continuance grew more sophisticated, something more, images, sounds, simple representations of the beings who had sent it. And embedded in all of that, carried in the pulse patterns of every transmission, the mathematical signature of an electromagnetic launcher. The unmistakable fingerprint of a railgun. We heard your shot, the probe would say in the language of physics. We have one too. We know what it means to fire into the dark. We know what it feels like to not know if anyone is listening. Someone is listening. You are not alone. Alicia Torres stood on the observation deck of the Mars launch facility and watched First Knock become a point of light, and then a dimming point and then nothing at all. Her mother's voice in her ear, via the communication link from Earth, a 4-minute delay that felt very long in that specific moment. Did it go? It went, Alicia said. A 4-minute silence. Then, good. Alicia looked at the dark sky. At the stars that were not stars but whole suns, each one possibly warming a world, each world possibly holding something that looked at its own sky and wondered the same thing she had wondered her whole life. She thought about what Dr. Vance had said years ago in an interview that Alicia had memorized as a teenager. We don't always know in advance which kind of limit it is, so we just keep knocking. She kept her eyes on the sky until there was nothing left to see. Then she went back inside and started planning what came next. The galactic continuance had a word. It was a word in the ancient Cormal language, the diplomatic lingua franca of the continuance, used in formal contexts across all 47 member species. The word was Vethalan, and it roughly translated as, the silence before understanding. It was used to describe the moment in diplomacy when all parties had finished speaking and had not yet begun truly listening, the gap between words and meaning. After the Mars meeting, after the debates and the hearings and the probe launches and the slow, grinding, extraordinary work of 2 civilizations learning to exist in the same space, a new word entered in formal continuance usage. The word was borrowed directly from English. It was railgun. Not as a military term. Not as a technological designation. As something else. As shorthand for a specific concept that the continuance had not previously had a word for, because it had not, before humanity, needed one. The concept was this: Doing something no one thought you could do, with more power than anyone thought you had, in less time than anyone thought was possible, and then continuing from there. V3 Railgun. The economic model meant the Seoul collective representative had arrived at a solution that nobody else in the negotiation had considered. Dovel's been railgunned meant the supreme arbiter had encountered an argument he couldn't counter and was regrouping. The Class 4 situation in Outer Reach sector got railgunned meant the primitive civilization in question had leapfrogged a development phase that every other civilization had taken centuries to navigate. Krelin heard the word used for the first time in this new sense in a council session, 6 cycles after the Mars meeting, when a young Dranan aide used it to describe a human proposal on trade framework restructuring. She stopped the session. "What did you just say?" she asked the aide. The aide looked alarmed. Ambassador, I apologize if... No, Krelin said. I want to understand the usage. You used the word railgun as a verb. Yes, Ambassador. The aide shifted, uncertain. It's become fairly common. An informal usage. To describe a situation where someone achieves something unexpected with disproportionate energy. Krelin looked at the aide for a long moment. Where did the usage originate? She said. I'm not certain, Ambassador. It's been in circulation for about 2 cycles. Krelin turned back to the council table. She thought about Atlas 1. She thought about the desert crater and the dust in the Arizona sky and the prime numbers scrolling across a screen. She thought about Sarah Vance's answer to her question at the end of the Mars meeting, "We're afraid of stopping, more afraid of stopping than of what's next." And she thought about what it meant that the galaxy had taken a human weapon and turned it into a verb for human ambition. She thought about what Dr. Okafor's interstellar paper had started. She thought about First Knock traveling through the dark. She thought about T-7714 and the species there who had, in the 6 cycles since the probe was detected, begun responding, not to First Knock, which was still years from their system, but to the electromagnetic transmissions that preceded it. Responding with their own prime numbers. Their own mathematical sequences. Their own tentative, reaching, alive-in-the-universe signals. She thought about the ancient one Yella's words. The one that changed everything, surprised everyone at every turn from the very beginning. She opened her session notes and wrote something. Then she looked up at the waiting council. "Continue," she said. The note she had written was the opening line of a new report. Report number 657. Filed to the Continuance Bureau of Developing Worlds, copied to the Inner Council, marked for the archives that every member species could access. The opening line was, "I have watched humanity for 116 of their years, and I have filed 656 reports in that time, and I have been wrong about them in every single one." It was, by the standards of continuance diplomatic reporting, a remarkable opening. Diplomatic reports did not generally begin with the author's admission of error. They were carefully hedged, qualified, referenced to prior reports, built on the accumulated certainty of institutional knowledge. Krelin's 657th report built on no prior certainty. It said, "I was wrong and here is what I learned." It said, "We have been watching this species for over a century and we have been watching the wrong things. We watched their weapons and their wars and their limits. We did not watch what they did with their limits. We did not watch what happened when they encountered something impossible. We did not notice that impossible does not mean the same thing to them that it means to us." It said, "They build things that don't exist yet and then they look at what they've built and they see the next thing that doesn't exist yet. They are a species in motion, permanently, irreversibly, in every direction at once. And the direction they're moving in is toward, not away. Toward the unknown. Toward the difficult. Toward the limit, always toward the limit to find out if it's really there." It said, "In 116 years they went from fighting each other with metal and fire to firing probes at stars. They did not do this because they planned it. They did it because each step revealed the next step and they took it." It said, "The galaxy has not encountered this before. Or rather, it has encountered it once. In the species that, as Elder Yella noted, changed the shape of everything. We did not recognize it then and we nearly failed to recognize it now." It said, "I recommend that the continuance update its development models. Not just for Earth. For every world we monitor. Because if there is one species capable of exceeding every projection, there may be others, and we have been filing them as low priority." And it said, at the very end, in a turn of phrase that Krelin spent 3 days crafting and was still not entirely satisfied with. "The galaxy learned a new word from humanity. The word is their name for a machine that takes everything available and channels it into a single point with overwhelming force. They use this word as a verb now, in our corridors and our sessions, to describe something that achieves the impossible through concentration of will. I find this fitting. I find it fitting because the machine they built, the first one in the desert on the planet they call Earth, was not just a weapon. It was a statement. It said, we have more in us than you think. It said, we are not bound by the limits you have assigned us. It said, we are here and we are capable and we intend to be present for whatever comes next. The galaxy heard that statement. The galaxy is still finding the words to answer it. 22 cycles after the Mars meeting. 154 Earth years. Sarah Vance had been dead for 63 of them. She had died at 91 in her garden in Tucson, on an afternoon in October, with the Arizona sky above her the color of everything she had ever loved. Marcus had been with her. He had been in his 80s by then, slower but still sharp, still finding things to be enthusiastic about. He had held her hand. She had told him she was proud of him. He had told her she had built something that would last longer than any of them could imagine. She had told him to stop being sentimental and make sure the Atlas 12 thermal management report got reviewed by Friday. He had. Marcus Webb died at 97, in the year that Earth's provisional continuance membership was formally ratified. He did not live to see the ratification signed. He died 17 days before the ceremony, but he had read the draft agreement and had submitted 7 pages of notes to the negotiating team, most of which were incorporated. His last message to the team, dictated from a hospital bed and sent via a communication link to Port Aries, included the line, HFY, remember that we built this from nothing and we can keep building. Don't stop. Sarah never stopped. Don't you? Nobody who received that message was able to read it in its entirety without stopping to compose themselves for at least a few minutes. The lead negotiator, a 48-year-old diplomat named Clara Reyes, granddaughter of Colonel Lisa Reyes, paused the session when she read it and spent 4 minutes looking at nothing in particular. Then she said, okay. Let's finish this. And they did. The ratification ceremony was held at Port Aries, in a chamber that had been expanded and redesigned specifically for the occasion, large enough for representatives of all 47 continuance species plus the human delegation, with a ceiling clear enough to see the Martian sky and the stars beyond it. Creelan Sauce was there. She was old now, very old by Vitharii standards. Her slate blue skin had lightened to something almost silver. Her 4 eyes had lost some of their sharpness. She walked with assistance. But she was there because there was no universe in which she would have missed this. She had watched Earth for 173 years. She had filed 712 reports. She had argued for contact for 37 years before it was approved. She had overseen the Mars meeting, the membership negotiations, the T-7714 contact initiative, the Atlas development monitoring, the public communication protocols. She had fought for an accelerated membership timeline in 12 council sessions and had lost 6 of them and won 6 of them, and the final result was the ceremony happening right now. She watched Ambassador Clara Reyes sign the membership document, watched her hand move steadily across the page, leaving a mark on the future, and she felt something she had been feeling more and more often as she aged. Gratitude. Not for what humanity had given the continuance, though they had given it much. Not for her own career or her reports or her arguments. But for the specific, irreplaceable gift of being the one who had been watching when it happened. When a species on a backwater blue planet built something in a desert and pointed it at the sky and said, how far can we reach? And kept reaching. And kept reaching. And kept reaching. After the ceremony, in the quiet of a side corridor, Clara found Creelan standing alone, looking through a small porthole at the Martian surface. Ambassador Sauce, Clara said. Creelan turned. Her 4 eyes, dim with age, still held the particular quality of attention that Clara had heard about from everyone who had ever met her, the sense of someone who was genuinely, completely, carefully there. Ambassador Reyes, Creelan said. Your grandmother would be proud. I know, Clara said. She told me to tell you that if I ever met you. Pause. Your grandmother said that? She recorded a message. Before she died. Clara smiled. She said, tell Creelan that she was right to keep watching, and tell her thank you for not giving up on us, and tell her we weren't going to stop anyway, but it's nice to know someone noticed. Creelan was quiet for a long moment. Sarah Vance said something similar to me, she said. At the end of the Mars meeting. She asked me what I was going to write in my next report. Her voice was very quiet, very measured, in the way of someone carrying something precious. I told her I was going to write that the continuance had been asking the wrong question. Pause. She asked me what the right question was. What did you say? Clara asked. I said I didn't know yet, Creelan said. I said I thought I was still learning it. She turned back to the porthole. To the surface of Mars, red and cold and impossibly alive with humanity's presence. I think I know it now. What is it? Krillin was quiet for a moment. The right question, she said, is not what a species is or what it can do, or where it ranks on a development scale, or how quickly it advances or how powerful its weapons are. She paused. The right question is, what does it do when it reaches the edge of what is possible and looks over? She turned from the porthole. Does it step back? Or does it lean forward? Clara looked at her. What do we do? She asked. She knew the answer. She wanted to hear Krillin say it. You lean forward, Krillin said. Every time. All of you. Every generation. You lean forward. Pause very long, very still. That is what no one in the galaxy could find words for when you fired that first railgun. It was not the power of it. It was not the velocity or the energy or the engineering. It was she searched for the word. The direction of it. You built a machine to reach as far as possible and you pointed it at the future and you fired. She looked at Clara. Every species eventually builds such a machine. But not every species points at the same direction. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Ambassador Sauce. Krillin. She paused. Would you like to go outside? To the surface. Krillin looked at her. I've never stood on a planet's surface other than my own, she said. I know, Clara said. We checked. She held out a suit. The ceremony is done. The documents are signed. The galaxy is changed. She looked at the porthole, at the red, ancient living surface of Mars. Caro, come out. Let's look at it together. A long pause. Then Krillin took the suit. They stood on the surface of Mars. The two of them, Ambassador Clara Reyes of Earth and Ambassador Emeritus Krillin Sauce of the Vithariae, one of 47 species in the galaxy's largest governing body, and they looked up. The sky on Mars was not blue. It was a bruised, pinkish-orange color that turned at the edges, where the atmosphere thinned, into something closer to purple, and above that, stars. Stars. Everywhere. Hundreds of them. Thousands. And among them, if you knew where to look, and Clara did, the tiny invisible point of light that was not a star but a probe. First knock, still traveling. Still broadcasting. Still reaching. And 18 light years away, if the signals that had been arriving for the past 60 years could be trusted, and the Xena Communications team said they could, something was listening. Something was reaching back. The galaxy was full. That was the thing. The actual, specific thing that humanity had spent its entire history half believing and now knew to be true. The galaxy was full of things that looked up and wondered and reached and built. And it was full of the silence between them, the enormous, cold, starlit silence. And in that silence there were signals if you knew what to listen for. If you were willing to fire into the dark and find out. Clara looked at the stars and thought about Sarah Vance, who had stood in a desert in Arizona and wondered how far a machine could reach. She thought about Marcus Webb, who had sat on steps after a test firing and asked if anyone was out there. She thought about Alicia Torres, who had launched First Knock and watched it disappear and believed it would reach someone. She thought about Jamie Torres, her great-grandmother's colleague, who had said take me with you in Urdu and meant it as love. She thought about all the people who had kept reaching when the limit said stop. She thought about the railgun. Not as a weapon. As a statement. We have more in us than you think. Beside her, Krillin raised one long-fingered hand and touched the surface of her helmet. A Vithariae gesture Clara had learned that meant, I want to remember this. Krillin, Clara said. Yes. In 657 reports, Clara said, did you ever find the words? For what we are. A long pause. Long enough that Clara started to think maybe the answer was no, and that no was okay, that some things lived beyond words and that was all right. Then Krillin said, in the 657th report, I wrote that the galaxy was still finding words. Pause. I think I have found them now. What are they? Krillin looked up. At the stars. At the dark. At the signals traveling through it, from Earth to T-7714, from 47 worlds to each other, from all of them to everywhere that might be listening. HFY, she said. Clara blinked. It was Urdu. She knew enough to recognize it. From here on, from here for me. It is a phrase from your language, Krillin said. One of your languages. I found it in a message your Marcus Webb used it. In his last communication. He wrote, HFY, remember that we built this from nothing. She paused. I looked up the phrase. It does not translate perfectly. But the closest translation is, from this moment, for me, everything begins. Pause. That is the word I have been looking for. That is what humanity is. She looked at Clara. You are a species for whom every moment is the moment that everything begins. You do not carry the weight of your history as a ceiling. You carry it as a floor. And from it you build upward. Clara was quiet. Is that good? She asked. It terrified us, Creelan said. For a very long time. A species that does not stop is a species that cannot be predicted. Pause. But I have spent 173 years watching you, and I have learned something that my colleagues are still learning. She looked at the stars. A species that cannot be predicted, that leans forward, that fires into the dark and waits to see what echoes back. That species does not need to be feared. Why not? Clara asked. Because, Creelan said, they are too busy being remarkable to be dangerous. The Martian wind moved across the surface, raising a thin drift of red dust that spiraled up and dispersed and was gone. The two women, one human, one not, both standing on a world that neither had been born on, both looking at the same stars, were quiet for a long time. Then Clara said, "What happens next?" Creelan's 4 eyes reflected the stars. "I don't know," she said. "That is the most honest thing I can tell you. After 173 years of watching and 657 reports, after everything that has happened and everything that is coming, I do not know what happens next." A long pause. "With any other species that would concern me. And with us," Clara said. "With you," Creelan said, and the Vitharii equivalent of a smile moved through her 4 narrow eyes like light through deep water. "It is the most exciting thing I have ever said." The stars were out in their thousands. Somewhere in the dark between them, First Knock traveled on, broadcasting, reaching, saying hello in the language of mathematics and physics and the specific, irreplaceable vocabulary of beings who look at the void and decide to speak into it anyway. Somewhere 18 light-years away something was listening. And somewhere in the archives of the galactic continuance, in the Bureau of Developing Worlds, in the file marked Earth, formerly Class 7, now full member, Continuance Standard Year 4271, there were 712 reports filed by Ambassador Creelan Sauce. 712 documents built from 173 years of watching. The last one ended with these words. They fired a railgun. And the galaxy, which had seen everything and filed everything and thought it had words for everything, had to learn new ones. The end.